In the summer of 2009, a man named Wayne Pruitt stood in the receiving bay of the Cass County Grain Elevator Co-op outside Logansport, Indiana, and told Ruth Voss that her corn was unmarketable. He said it with the patient, slightly sorrowful tone of a man delivering news a person should already know. He consulted a clipboard. He pointed out that her variety mix was non-certified, non-standard, and would contaminate his test batches if he ran it across his probe. He said she was welcome to haul it to a specialty buyer, if she could find one, but that the co-op could not handle it. And frankly, what she was growing was a museum, not a farm. Ruth thanked him, loaded her truck, and drove back to her 38 acres on the Eel River Road. She did not argue. She had not expected to win that conversation. What she had not told Wayne Pruitt, because he had not asked, was that her mother had been saving those seed lines since 1952, and that 7 years after he refused to weigh her corn, she would sell what she ground from it for $214,000. That is the number. You may be wondering how a woman with 38 acres in central Indiana arrived at a figure like that, when the elevator price for a bushel of commodity corn in the year she made it was $3.70. The explanation takes a little time. It is worth the time, because what Wayne Pruitt saw in his receiving bay that day and what was actually growing in Ruth Voss's fields are two very different things, and understanding the difference is the whole story. Ruth Voss was 59 years old in 2009, and she was known in Cass County for two things: her silence and her corn. She had farmed the Eel River place alone since her husband Harold died in 1998, working 38 acres of bottomland and creek-edge ground that most of her neighbors considered too small and too varied to bother running efficiently. Her equipment was old. Her truck was a 1988 Ford F-25O, maroon over rust, that she had bought from an auction for $4,000 and had not seen the inside of a dealership since. She kept a border collie named Rue, who worked the field edges when Ruth walked the rows in the mornings, the two of them moving together in a companionable quiet that people who saw it occasionally remarked upon. Ruth was not the kind of person who explained herself in either direction, to those who admired her patience or those who considered it stubbornness. She grew her corn. She walked her rows. She kept her mother's cedar box in the back bedroom. Let me tell you about that cedar box, because it is where this story actually begins. Edna Voss, Ruth's mother, started saving corn seed in the summer of 1952. She had grown up on this same ground watching her own mother plant open-pollinated varieties that her grandmother had carried from Ohio in the 1890s. And when the hybrid seed catalogs began arriving in earnest in the late 40s, and the extension agents started making their rounds with their projections and their yield comparisons, Edna listened politely and kept saving her own. By the time she handed the box to Ruth in the early 1980s, it held 14 labeled cloth bags, each tied with a different color of kitchen twine, each penciled in Edna's careful school-teacher handwriting: Blue Claridge, Bloody Butcher, Wapsie Valley, Nothstein Dent, Reed's Yellow Dent, and 9 others besides. The box itself smelled of dry grain and old cedar and faintly of something Ruth could never name, but associated entirely with her mother's hands. She kept it on the shelf in the back bedroom. She never opened it around visitors. It was not a display. Edna had given Ruth the box on a March afternoon in 1983, the year Ruth and Harold moved into the farmhouse, and she had not handed it over with any ceremony. She had carried it in from the car, set it on the kitchen table, and opened it and taken out the blue Claridge bag and held it in both palms, and said that this particular variety had survived a drought in 1953, that had taken most of the county's corn, and that what survived a drought once carried something in it that was worth keeping. She had said it in the same tone she might have used to explain where the extra canning lids were kept. Then she had put the bag back, closed the box, and said Ruth should plant no fewer than 200 stalks of each variety each year, and select only from the strongest 50 for seed, and never let a variety go to only one season's planting, without a backup lot stored separately. She said it had taken her grandmother and her mother and her 30 years to learn the ground that those seeds knew, and that the seeds knew it better than any of them. And the job was to keep the relationship going. Then she poured coffee and changed the subject. Ruth had written those instructions in the inside cover of the seed notebook that same evening, and she had followed them without variation every year since. What Edna had preserved in those cloth bags, and what Ruth had continued to grow and select and preserve across 30 more years, was something the grain elevator had no instrument to measure. Each of those varieties was what plant breeders call open pollinated, which means that the plants in a given stand are not genetic clones of one another. They are related, they share a lineage, but each individual plant carries its own slightly different arrangement of traits. Some have deeper root systems, some silk 3 days earlier in a dry year when timing is everything. Some set their ears lower on the stalk, which matters when a wind comes through in late July and the tall-eared plants tip over and the short-eared ones do not. The hybrid seed that filled Dale Masser's planter tanks every April was different. Hybrid seed, the F1 cross that the seed companies sell, produces a uniform stand. Every plant is, for practical purposes, genetically identical. The yield in a good year can be impressive because the uniformity means every plant is expressing the same high production traits at the same time. What that uniformity also means, though, is something the yield charts do not account for. When a drought or a fungus or a late-season heat spike finds the weakness in one plant's design, it has found the weakness in all of them. Ruth had understood this in a practical sense long before she understood it in any scientific sense. She had seen it in the field. In a dry July, her mixed stand of open-pollinated varieties would show stress unevenly. Here a row of Wapsie Valley, flagging a little, its broad leaves curling at the edges. 3 rows over, a stand of Bloody Butcher holding dark green, and upright because its root system, selected across decades of Cass County summers, reached 8 inches deeper into the moisture that lingered below the clay layer. The individual variation that the seed companies called inconsistency was, in Ruth's fields, a hedge. It was the ground insuring itself against a single point of failure. She had been selecting for this, systematically, every year since she took over the seed work from Edna. She walked her rows in late August with strips of orange cloth, tying a marker at the stalk base of every plant that had held its color deepest into the dry stretch, every plant whose roots gripped the ground when she put her hands around the stalk and tried to rotate it. At harvest, she hand-picked seed ears only from marked stalks. Over 60 years of this practice, hers and her mother's combined, the varieties in the cedar box had been slowly, deliberately shaped to 38 acres of Cass County bottomland. They were not general-purpose corn, they were her corn. Dale Masser farmed the 220 acres adjoining Ruth's place to the north and east. He was 47 in 2009 and had grown up watching his father work a dairy operation on the same ground before the dairy collapsed in the 80s and the family converted to row crops. Dale was a careful man, a genuine farmer, not a reckless one. And when the commodity prices climbed in the mid-2000s and the lending terms looked favorable, he made the calculation that thousands of his neighbors were making at the same time. He financed $340,000 in new equipment at 5.9% over 7 years, planted certified hybrid seed on every acre, applied the recommended herbicide and fertilizer packages, and set his planter depth and population at exactly what the seed company's agronomist recommended. His operation looked, from the county road, like what a modern corn farm was supposed to be. His combine was a late-model green machine with a GPS receiver on the cab roof. His planter had row-by-row shutoffs. He had a grain bin system that could handle his whole harvest in 4 days. He came to the Logansport Farm Bureau meeting in March of 2010 and sat in the third row and listened to the extension agent explain that heirloom varieties and small-scale direct marketing were viable for lifestyle operations, but that the economics of scale made them impractical for serious producers. He nodded at the right moments. He was not being dismissive of Ruth. He simply believed what he was hearing because the evidence in front of him, the new equipment, and the price projections, and the agronomist's population charts all pointed in one direction. Wayne Pruitt was at that meeting. He had brought a slide deck. He was 52 years old, had managed the Cass County Co-op elevator for 11 years, had a degree in agricultural economics from Purdue, and was, by every credible standard, an expert. He was not a bad man. He was methodical, fair to his members, careful with the co-op's finances, and genuinely believed that what he was about to say was in the best interests of everyone in the room, including Ruth Voss, who sat in the last row with her jacket over her arm and said nothing. He put up a slide showing price projections, quality discount schedules, and the testing protocols that the Chicago Board of Trade required for any corn moving into the commercial supply chain. He explained that non-standard varieties introduced variability that created risk for the elevator's certification status. Non-certified, he said, turning briefly toward the back of the room in a way that was not pointed, but was not accidental. A museum piece, not a market crop. He said it without cruelty. The room was with him. Ruth drove home in the dark, Rue asleep on the bench seat beside her, and did not say anything about it to anyone for 3 days. She stood in the milk house on the 4th day and looked at the old cream separator that had been standing in the corner since Harold's time, and she moved it to the far wall, and she ordered the stone mill. If you have ever felt that the room with the slides and the projections was measuring the wrong thing, you may understand what Ruth understood that winter. Leave a comment below and tell me what you decided on the drive home. She bought the stone mill in the autumn of 2010. It was a used 8-inch granite plate mill from a baker in Columbus, Ohio, who had upgraded to a larger unit, and Ruth drove 4 hours each way in the maroon Ford to bring it home in the truck bed wrapped in burlap. She bolted it to a bench in the milk house and spent 2 weeks learning how to dress the stones, which meant recutting the furrow pattern on the grinding faces with a mill bill, a small specialized chisel, to maintain the angle and depth that allowed the ground meal to flow outward from the eye to the skirt without building up heat at the center. The gap between the stones, called the dress, had to be set to within a few thousandths of an inch to produce the grind she wanted, fine enough for massa, but not so fine that it heated. She learned this by grinding and testing, adjusting the gap by fractional turns of the adjustment nut, and then holding the meal in her palm and feeling for warmth. It should not have warmth. That was the point. Let me tell you about why it should not have warmth. Because this mechanism is the second engine of the whole story. A kernel of open-pollinated corn contains 3 parts: the endosperm, which is the starchy white interior most people think of as corn, the pericarp, which is the outer bran layer, and the germ, which is the small, oil-rich embryo at the base of the kernel, the part that would become a root and a seedling if the kernel were planted. The germ is where the flavor lives. It contains polyunsaturated oils, including linoleic acid, and a fat-soluble form of vitamin E called tocopherol, and a collection of aromatic compounds that are responsible for the smell of fresh cornbread pulling from an oven, a smell that has almost nothing to do with the cornbread smell of most commercial mixes, because most commercial cornmeal is processed on high-speed steel roller mills, where the grain heats to temperatures between 160 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit during grinding. At those temperatures, the germ oils oxidize rapidly. They go rancid, and the processors know they go rancid. And the solution they use is to remove the germ entirely before milling, producing what is sold as degerminated cornmeal, which has a shelf life of 18 months and a flavor that is approximately that of chalk. The pericarp is removed as well because its ferulic acid and other antioxidants interfere with the standardized color. What remains is endosperm only, starch only, ground fine and fast, and it is this product that fills the yellow box on every grocery shelf in America. What Ruth's granite stones produced was different in every way that mattered. The stones ground cold. She measured the temperature of the meal coming off the skirt with a probe thermometer and kept it under 108 degrees Fahrenheit on every run. The germ came through intact, its oils undamaged, its aromatics preserved. The pericarp came through as a fine, speckled texture that gave her blue corn masa a slate-colored depth, and her yellow dent grits a faint gold fleck. The shelf life was 6 weeks. She wrote the date on every bag. She told every customer what that meant. Buy what you will use in 6 weeks. Keep it in the freezer. And what you have is something that has not existed in commercial distribution in this country since before most people now living were born. The meal from her 2011 season sold out at the Logansport Farmers Market in 11 weeks. She raised her price from $2.20 a pound to $2.80, and it's still sold out. She began a waiting list in a composition book she kept in her jacket pocket and called it, privately, her order log, which was a more dignified name than what it was, which was more demand than she could fill with one 8-inch stone and her own 2 hands. A woman from Indianapolis named Sandra drove up on a Saturday morning in October of 2011, having seen the mill mentioned in a regional food newsletter, and stood at Ruth's market table for nearly 10 minutes before she spoke. She lifted each bag in turn and smelled through the paper. She asked Ruth what the shelf life was, and Ruth told her 6 weeks, refrigerated or frozen. Sandra said that was a problem for retail distribution, and Ruth said she was not selling to retail distribution. Sandra looked at the bags again and said she worked with 2 restaurant kitchens in Indianapolis and asked how much was available by the month. Ruth told her the current output. Sandra said she would take all of the Wapsie Valley grits and all of the blue corn masa on a standing order, and could Ruth tell her when the next milling date was. Ruth wrote it in the order log, and Sandra wrote a check on the spot and carried 2 bags to her car and drove back to Indianapolis. That was the first account that was not a market table, and it was the beginning of understanding that what she was making was not a farmer's market product. It was something else, and the market had no category yet for what it was. Carla arrived in the spring of 2013. She was Ruth's niece, 24 years old, freshly degreed in food science from Purdue, and she came at her mother's urging after Ruth's sister called to say that Ruth was spending 16 hours a day milling grain alone and ought to have some help. Carla came with her internship on her resume and a genuine, earnest belief in evidence-based food production. She had written a paper in her senior seminar on the limitations of artisan food production at commercial scale, and had come away from the research with what she believed was a fair-minded conclusion, that the artisan food economy served a real market, but could not be treated as a viable model for widespread agricultural transformation. She was not dismissive about this. She simply understood, from the data she had been given, that the numbers did not pencil out at volume. She said as much on her third day, standing in the milk house while the smaller stone ran, pitching her observation carefully. That what Ruth had built was genuinely impressive as a boutique operation, but that the variety limitations would constrain any meaningful scale. She said the phrase boutique operation the same way Wayne Pruitt had said museum, not unkindly, with the quiet confidence of someone who believed they were describing a category of thing that was objectively true. Ruth adjusted the stone gap by a quarter turn and did not answer. She spent her first 2 weeks making notes on the mill's output and asking questions that Ruth answered one sentence at a time and watching the order log fill up with names from Indianapolis and Chicago and Terre Haute. On the 15th day, Carla ran a germ oil content test on Ruth's ground Wapsie Valley against a commercial yellow corn meal using a fat extraction method she had learned at school. She did not tell Ruth what she expected to find. The results came back at the end of the week. The commercial meal contained 0.4 grams of fat per 100 grams of dry weight, consistent with a fully degerminated product. Ruth's Wapsie Valley meal contained 4.1 grams. Carla looked at the number for a while. Then she asked Ruth to show her how to adjust the stone dress. The summer of 2012 had already happened by the time Carla arrived, and what happened in that summer was this. The worst drought to hit the Midwest since 1956 settled in across central Indiana in late June and stayed until October. The soil moisture readings at the Extension office in Logansport fell below the critical threshold for corn development by July 8th. The county average yield that year across all operations was 47 bushels per acre. For Dale Masser, on 220 acres of uniform hybrid corn with a $340,000 equipment note at $62,000 per year and a per bushel cost of production, he had calculated at $4.20, a 47-bushel yield meant 10,340 bushels at the elevator price of $6.80, which came to $70,312 gross, against costs of $43,428 and a loan payment he could not defer. He did not lose the farm that year. He came close. He refinanced the equipment note that October, extending the term, and he sold 60 acres of the north parcel to a neighbor to service the balloon payment. He sat in the Farm Bureau meeting in November and listened to the insurance adjuster explain the claims process, and did not say anything for a long time. His equipment note was paid down but not paid off. His operation was smaller than it had been the previous spring. He drove home past Ruth's place on the county road and looked at her stubble in the fields and did not stop. Ruth Voss, on 38 acres of open, pollinated, mixed varieties with root systems selected for this exact ground across 60 years of dry Augusts, yielded 94 bushels per acre. She walked her rows in late July with Rue at her heel, and she did not say anything to anyone about what she was seeing because there was nothing to say. The plants were doing what they had been bred to do. The bloody butcher rows were darkest green along the creek draw where the deep roots had found the water below the clay. The Wapsie Valley and blue claridge, which were somewhat shallower rooted, had slowed their growth but were still setting ears, their silks browning a week later than they had in wetter years, their root systems having pulled enough from the subsoil to finish the season. The genetic diversity in the stand meant that when the heat pressed down, different plants had different tolerances and different solutions, and the stand as a whole held where a uniform stand could not. She ended the season with 3,572 bushels of grain from those 38 acres. She milled the better part of it through the fall and into the winter, and she sold every pound she could produce, and the waiting list in the composition book doubled in length by February. Wayne Pruitt drove out to the Eel River place in early August of that dry year. He came alone, without a clipboard for once, and he walked the fence line along the road and looked at Ruth's rows for a long time without saying anything. Ruth was retying a stake on the seed selection plot when he came around the truck, and she looked up and he said quietly that he had not expected this. She said she knew. He said her corn looked like a different year than everyone else's. She said it was the same year. She offered him a glass of water, and he accepted it. And they stood on the porch, and he asked after a pause what varieties those were in the third planting. She told him. Bloody Butcher, mostly, with some Reed's yellow dent on the east end. He said he did not know those names. She said her mother had started those lines in 1952. He went quiet after that. He thanked her for the water and drove back toward town. She watched his truck from the porch until it cleared the tree line, Rue sitting at her boot with her ears up. Marcus Fehrenbach came into the story in the autumn of 2014. He was a Chicago-based grain buyer and restaurant supplier, 40 years old, who had been building a portfolio of artisan grain sources for high-end restaurants and specialty food retailers across the Midwest. He had heard about Ruth's operation from a chef at a small Indianapolis restaurant who had bought her blue corn masa at the farmer's market and served it once as a polenta course and received more comment cards about it than about any dish he had prepared in 4 years. Fehrenbach drove to Logansport on a Thursday, called ahead by one day, and arrived at the Eel River place in a clean gray sedan that he pulled to the side of the gravel lane and got out of slowly, looking at the fields before he came to the door. Ruth made coffee. He tasted 4 of her products at the kitchen table: the blue corn masa, the yellow dent grits, the white Nothstein flour, and a coarse-ground Wapsie Valley polenta. He did not speak during the tasting. He held the blue corn masa in a dry pinch and smelled it, then let it rest on his palm for a moment. He set the pinch bowl down carefully. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he would like to know her price. She told him. He did not negotiate. He asked how much volume she could produce in a calendar year, and she told him that as well. He said he would take all of it, and asked if she had considered expanding to 8 accounts, and she said she had not, because she had not had 8 accounts to consider. He said he would start with 4 restaurants and build from there, and if she were willing to add masa-grade blue claridge to the product line, he believed he could place it with a tortilla maker in Chicago who had been looking for a domestic heritage source for 3 years. Ruth said she could plant more blue claridge. He said good and drove back to Chicago. By the 2016 growing season, Ruth's product line had expanded to 7 items, and Marcus had placed her corn with 11 accounts across Chicago, Indianapolis, and Columbus. The grits were on the menu of a restaurant in the River North neighborhood, attributed on the menu by variety and county. The masa was going to the tortilla maker in Pilsen and to 2 other artisan food producers. The coarse polenta was moving through a specialty grocer in Indianapolis. Carla had taken over the variety management and the quality records, and she had built a tracking system for germ oil content, grind temperature, and shelf life data across every batch, and she had written what she described to Ruth as a quality protocol, and Ruth described as a very long version of what her mother had written in the back of the seed notebook. The mill was running 6 days a week by October. Carla had sourced a second stone mill, a 12-inch granite plate unit, and the milk house was warm with the sound of grinding from 4 in the morning until the light went. Rue was 9 years old and preferred the porch now, sleeping in the low autumn sun while the mill ran inside, lifting her head when the truck pulled in and lowering it again when she recognized the step. In November of 2016, Carla brought the year's sales totals to the kitchen table. Ruth was at the stove and did not turn around when Carla set the sheet of paper down. Carla sat for a moment before she read the number. She had run the calculation 3 times, because the first time she had assumed an arithmetic error and recalculated, and the second time she had cross-referenced against the individual account invoices, and the third time she had simply sat at the desk for a while and looked at it. Then she had printed it and carried it to the kitchen. The total gross sales for the 2016 season were $214,000. From 38 acres of open pollinated corn and a cedar box that had traveled through 3 generations and 2 stone mills in an old milk house in Cass County, Indiana. At the co-op elevator price of $3.70 per bushel, the same 38 acres under commodity hybrid corn at the county average yield would have grossed just under $21,000 before costs. Ruth turned from the stove and looked at the sheet of paper on the table. She looked at it for a long time. $214,000. The kitchen was quiet for a moment after that, the mill standing silent in the milk house for once. The only sound, the faint tick of the radiator in the corner. Carla was 27 years old, and she had spent 4 years working beside Ruth, and she had her germ oil tables and her batch logs and her Purdue degree. And she had known for the better part of 2 years that this number was approaching, and still when it landed in the room, it landed differently than she had expected. It was not that the number was large, though it was larger than anything Ruth had ever made from those 38 acres. It was that, on the same 38 acres, with the same growing days and the same creek and the same soil pH and the same Indiana weather, the commodity path would have paid $21,000. The difference between $21,000 and $214,000 was not luck and was not marketing and was not a particularly good year for corn prices. It was what was in the cedar box. It was what Edna Voss had written in the seed notebook in 1952, and what Ruth had added to it every August since, and what Carla was now adding in her own hand. Ruth said the coffee was ready, and Carla got 2 mugs from the cabinet, and they sat down and did not say anything particular about the number at all. It had said what it needed to say. Carla called Wayne Pruitt that winter. She introduced herself and told him the 2016 figures in plain language and invited him to come see the operation. He came in February of 2017 on a cold, gray morning, and Ruth walked him through the milk house and showed him both mills and the temperature logs and the batch records and the product inventory. He stood in the doorway of the back bedroom and read the variety labels on Edna's cloth bags in the cedar box on the shelf. He looked at the labels for a while without touching the box. He said, after a time, that he owed her an apology. She said he had been doing his job the way his training told him to do it. He said yes, but the training had not included this. She said most training did not. He asked if he could send 2 of the co-op's younger members out to see the mill, and she said yes. He drove back to Logansport and sent the 2 members, and they came. and Ruth and Carla showed them the whole operation, from seed selection to batch log, and in the spring, one of them converted 4 acres of his operation to a blue claridge trial, and kept a notebook with his selection marks through the season. Dale Masser was the other member. He had lost the 60-acre north parcel in 2012 and had spent the years since quietly watching what Ruth was doing from the county road. The way a person watches something they cannot yet name as a lesson. He came to the milk house that February afternoon with his cap in his hands and asked Ruth if she would sell him seed from the Wapsie Valley line. She said she would, at the rate she charged everyone, which was $12 a pound for properly selected, open-pollinated seed, with the understanding that he would save his own seed from the strongest performing plants each season and keep records of what he observed. He agreed to this and took his seed home and in late April planted 4 acres on the south-facing parcel, where the drainage was best. The following summer, when his Wapsie Valley came in, and he walked those 4 rows and saw the variation he was looking at. Different plant heights and ear sets and silk timings all working in concert. He stood at the field edge for a while and looked at his hybrid corn in the adjacent block. He did not make any dramatic statement about it. He went home, and that evening he worked through his numbers for a long time at the kitchen table. He planted 12 acres of Wapsie Valley the following spring and reduced his hybrid acreage accordingly. His equipment note still had 3 years on it. He had the seed, and he had the 4 acres of notes from the season before, and he had the beginning of something he was only now beginning to understand how to read. The cedar box sits on the same shelf in the back bedroom. Carla added 6 variety labels to it across 4 years of her management, including a blue-seeded flower type she developed from a blue clarage cross that the Chicago tortilla maker named and put on its packaging. The seed notebook is Ruth's now, the same cracked spine composition book Edna kept, with a new section in Carla's block printing running alongside Edna's penciled columns, the 2 handwritings sharing the page the way the 2 generations share the work. Rue died in the winter of 2018, and Ruth keeps her photograph above the smaller mill in the milk house. The border collie they have now, a young female named Slip, has learned to walk the morning rows with the same quiet that made people remark on Rue for years. What Wayne Pruitt measured in his receiving bay in 2009 was real. His probe tested moisture content, his scale weighed bushels, his certification checklist verified variety conformity. These are not fraudulent instruments. They measure what they are designed to measure accurately, and what they are designed to measure is the corn that flows into the commodity supply chain, which is not what Ruth was growing. The elevator's knowledge was correct within its own frame. It was simply pointed at the wrong thing. It was measuring a bushel price for a grain not being sold by the bushel, asking for a certification that applied to a market she had already left, testing for variety conformity that was the exact opposite of her product's value. $214,000 from 38 acres is not a number you get by competing in a system that has no instrument for what you actually have. It is a number you get by taking your corn home and grinding it yourself and selling what you understand the grain to be worth, which is different from what the elevator is prepared to pay. The method that Edna Voss carried in a cedar box from her mother's ground to her daughter's ground to her granddaughter's notebooks is not sentiment, it is not nostalgia. It is 60 years of deliberate selection on one specific piece of Cass County bottomland, producing corn genetically calibrated to that ground's moisture profile and soil depth and growing days in a way that no hybrid seed developed for a regional average can replicate. The stone mill is not romance. It is a specific temperature threshold, 108 degrees Fahrenheit, below which the germ oils survive and above which they do not. Every bag of meal that ships from the Eel River place is, in a precise and measurable sense, the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of women who paid close attention to one particular corner of the earth and acted on what they observed. Carla's fat extraction numbers did not discover something new. They confirmed something old, in a language the credentialed world could recognize. There is a kind of knowing that travels wide and fast, that generalizes from large data sets and best practices and county averages and slide decks and certified input packages, and it is genuinely useful at the scale it was designed for. There is another kind that travels narrow and slow, that takes 60 years to know one piece of ground in the particular way that ground deserves to be known, and it does not fit in a spreadsheet, and it cannot be purchased from a catalog, and the elevator has no line item for it. When the drought comes, one kind of knowing produces 47 bushels an acre, and a conversation with the bank about extending the note. The other kind produces 94 bushels and a mark in the seed notebook, about which rows held their color deepest into August, written down for whoever comes next. What is rigid breaks under the pressure it was not designed to hold. What was shaped to its place year by year, plant by plant, generation by generation, holds. The cedar box is still in the back bedroom. Slip is asleep on the porch in the morning. The corn is still growing.